Hello and thank you for being here. Today we're going to build upon last week's scaling system with Elden Ring's cool and flashy Ashes of War. Welcome to My Wife is VMC. I'm DMV and you're watching
Husbando Homebrew,
a show where we take pop culture to pen and paper.
So what have we got here today?
Today we'll be looking over at Elden Ring's Ashes of War system and how it builds on top of the scaling rules we did in the last video. If you haven't seen the scaling video, there will be a short recap in a bit, but I highly encourage you to pause this video and come back later so you have a better grasp on the rules. And with that, let's infuse our weapons with the like affinity and perform the subscribe battle art.
Part 1. Scaling Recap.
Let's take a hot minute to discuss scaling. This is the system I created to simulate the Souls game's alphabetical scaling mechanic that determines how well each individual weapon synergizes with your character stats. The system adds scaling values to each weapon with an ability and a grade, such as Strength B or Dexterity C. The scaling value's grade dictates the max value you can add from the indicated ability. So for example, you've got a Strength of 18 but your weapon's scaling value only has Strength D, you can only add a +1 rather than a +4. Most weapons have two scaling values, Strength and Dexterity. So you add them all and you get the scaling modifier, which is what you'll be using for attack rolls, damage rolls, and DCs that let you pick between Strength or Dexterity, like the Battlemaster's Maneuver DC. That's the gist of the rules, but the video on scaling delves deeper into the rule system and offers more optional rules for increasing scaling values. I hope you've got a good grasp on the scaling system, because we're about to walk through that boss wall and look at the Ashes of War rules in
Part 2. Ashes of War.
The Ashes of War system actually has some narrative quality to it, unlike the mostly mechanical scaling system from last time. These ashes contain memories of great warriors, whose experience in battle is baked into their ashes upon their demise. I guess that kind of explains why scarab beetles can collect these ashes with the dirt they roll up. An Ash of War is basically a reusable magic item, which can be applied to any non-magical weapon after finishing a long rest. For this video, let's take a look at the Bloody Slash Ash of War and dissect its different properties. First, an Ash of War is a magic item, so it has varying rarities. Second, it grants what's called an affinity, and it also describes the type of weapons that can be infused with this Ash of War. Lastly, it describes a special battle art unique to that Ash of War. This is a special skill or maneuver that grants you additional combat options while you're wielding a weapon that has this Ash of War. You'll also notice how it describes a saving throw but doesn't state the DC, so we'll get to that in a bit. Still with me so far? Of course you are. Let's take a look at the second property called Affinity in
Part 3. Affinities.
So looking at Bloody Slash, it mentions granting the Blood Affinity. This is one of the things that an Ash of War can grant to a weapon upon infusion. Much like the game, an affinity changes the scaling values of a weapon and potentially adds a new damage type. Yes, this is the part that gets weird and slightly more complicated. See, when you apply an Ash of War, the weapon gains an affinity, whether you like it or not. Granted, you have some control over it via wet blades, but I'll get to that in a bit. Let's take a scimitar that has scaling values of D and B as our example. Quick side note, the Ko-Fi document has a list of all PHB weapons with their scaling values. Now, let's take a look at the Blood Affinity again. It says here that it increases Charisma scaling by 2 and decreases all other scaling values by 1 and adds necrotic damage to the weapon. Since a scimitar doesn't have Charisma scaling, it starts with a D and then goes up from there. With a Blood Affinity, it gains a scaling value of Charisma C. It then decreases all scaling values by 1. So its Dexterity B scaling goes down to Dexterity C, its Strength D scaling can't go any lower, so it remains at Strength D. Remember that sample character from last video? Let's call him back, but this time let's give him a Charisma of 12. So he has a Strength of 18, a Dexterity of 15, and now a Charisma of 12. His scaling modifier with the scimitar before was a +3, but now with this Blood Affinity scimitar, it's a +4. Breaking that down, it's +1 from Strength D, +2 from Strength C, and another +1 from Charisma C. Then let's look at the necrotic damage granted by the Blood Affinity. Whenever this character deals 1d6 plus 4 while using this Blood Affinity Scimitar, the damage is split between slashing and necrotic, with one of them taking the remainder in case of odd numbers. So to recap, with a Blood Affinity, a regular scimitar goes from Strength D and Dexterity B to Strength D and Dexterity C and Charisma C. This basically lets you become a more effective blade-back warlock without having to pick Hexblade. There are a lot of affinities, all of which I just hoodwinked from the game itself. Let's take a few more examples with our humble scimitar here. Keen Affinity basically turns it into a Dexterity S scaling with no Strength scaling, which is cool for the super specialist types. Heavy goes hard in the other direction, turning that same scimitar into Strength A, but no other scaling at all. Cold adds Intelligence scaling, giving your scimitar a cool Strength D, Dexterity C, and Intelligence C scaling, which is great for blade-singing wizards who didn't dump Strength. There are quite a few other affinities that can really change the way you play. For shields, I hope it's fairly self-explanatory, as they give a simple damage reduction to certain damage types once per turn. Now that we've covered affinities, let's jump into the last property of an Ash of War in...
Part 4. Battle Arts.
When you hear Ashes of War, unique skills are probably the first things that come to mind unless you're weird and think of some obscure inactive DeviantArt page from the 2010s that had dreams of making a manga. Anyway, this is the part that grants you a new combat option while using a weapon infused with an Ash of War. A battle art has a few components to it. First is the focus point cost, or FP. In Elden Ring, the mind stat governs your FP, but we don't have any of that in D&D. So instead of using an attribute that might make your character even more MAD, I instead opted to use twice your proficiency bonus instead. This helps me regulate the FP cost of battle arts for better balancing, and it also keeps one less thing off a player's mind in terms of building their character. Some Ashes of War can be charged to produce a greater effect. Bloody Slash doesn't have this, but to give a quick example, the Ash of War Carrion Greatsword basically deals higher damage and provides greater range when charged. To charge an Ash of War's battle art, you need to forego one of your extra attacks. When you do so, however, you are left vulnerable and the next attack against you has advantage. Last but not least are saving throws. This one's a bit more straightforward, as it uses the scaling modifier of the weapon as the DC rather than just one singular attribute. I acknowledged this in the previous video, but yes, that does mean tracking different DCs depending on the weapon you're using with respect to that Ash of War. Luckily, not all Ashes of War require saving throws. So for Bloody Slash, its battle art costs 3 FP and allows you to fire off a 15-foot blood cone that deals 3d6 necrotic damage on a dex save. This is basically Burning Hands, but with blood. Note that not all Ashes of War deal direct damage or any kind of damage for that matter. For example, Cragblade grants you a 1d6 bludgeoning damage buff while you concentrate on it. Another example is Quickstep, which helps you reposition as a bonus action and makes opportunity attacks less effective against you. The updated document has a fairly decent list of Ashes of War to start you off, but I'll try my best to keep updating the list as I update this homebrew. Go ahead and put your requests in the comments. I'm quite a bit more likely to read while this channel's engagement is still low. Anyway, let's get to actually infusing the weapon with an Ash of War in...
Part 5. Ash of War Infusion.
So I've talked your ear off about what an Ash of War does, but I never actually discussed how to actually apply an Ash of War into a weapon. Until now! So the infusion process is fairly simple, it just has scenarios for certain use cases. So after finishing a long rest, you can take a wet blade and apply an Ash of War onto an uninfused weapon. Simple, right? Pretty much, for the most part at least. I also outlined how the resulting item would be named. So in the case of our scimitar here, it becomes a Blood Scimitar Bloody Slash in parentheses. I say uninfused as if that's a word, but note that I didn't say non-magical. See, it's simpler with a non-magical weapon. When you infuse one with an Ash of War, it becomes magical and it takes the rarity of the Ash of War. So what about a magic item? What if our scimitar is a +1 weapon? This is where it gets a little more involved. First, you need to have the requisite proficiency bonus for the resulting rarity of the magic item. And in the case of Ashes of War, the resulting item's rarity is one level higher than the item's rarity or the Ash of War's rarity, whichever is higher. And now the word rarity has gotten weird. So if our +1 scimitar is uncommon and the Ash of War Bloody Slash is also uncommon, the resulting weapon would have a rarity of, well, rare. This means that you need a proficiency bonus of +4, or you need to be at 9th level or higher to even be able to infuse your +1 scimitar with an uncommon Ash of War. If the Ash of War were rare, the resulting item would be very rare. So, this +1 scimitar, when infused with the Bloody Slash Ash of War, is named Blood +1 Scimitar Bloody Slash, in parentheses, with a rarity level of rare. The document has a table that shows you the requisite proficiency bonus needed to infuse a magic item of different rarities. As part of the same finishing long rest, you can also transfer Ashes of War between weapons or remove them entirely. Just like the infusion process, you will need a wet blade. Speaking of wet blades, there are several types, each of which grants a different set of affinities that you can choose from when you infuse an Ash of War onto a weapon or shield. This gives you a bit more freedom with your character's build and helps offset any negative values to the scaling modifier, or helps you lean in more on your higher stats. For DMs, I highly recommend you spread this out a bit in your world. As Jeremy Crawford once said, limitations make for interesting choices. So limiting your players' affinity choices for a while and letting their repertoire grow helps them appreciate it more down the line. So now that you know how Ashes of War works, let's play around with a few optional rules in
Part 6. Play around.
That was another doozy. Remember to check the Ko-Fi link for the updated version of the Tarnished Husbando's cookbook. It also contains new optional rules, specifically using shields as a weapon, as well as new weapon types based on Elden Ring's weapons, such as fists or claws. Let me know in the comments which Ash of War or magic items you want me to cover for the next update. Make sure you leave a like before you go, and don't forget to share this with your consort. This has been My Wife is DMC. I'm DMV, and I'll see you in the next Husbando Homebrew.